Hello to everyone logging on, and thank you for your patience as everyone joins us in the webinar room. We will begin in just a moment. All right, welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Resilient Yards, Keys for Successful Water Management and Pollinator Conservation with Dan Shaw. My name is Amanda Lance-Bramrup, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. Thank you all for joining us today for the next webinar of our 2025 series. Now for a few Zoom basics before we continue. When you have questions during the presentation, please place them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen, which you'll find at the bar at the bottom of your window. Questions placed into the chat will be asked to be redirected to the Q&A section. Lily Grimmeroth, our MPF Conservation Program Associate, will join Dan on screen at the end of the presentation to read your submitted questions aloud. As always, thank you to all of you joining live for your thoughtful question submissions. Now to introduce today's speaker, an experienced ecological restoration specialist, Dan Shaw. Dan has been involved in conservation and ecological restoration for over 30 years. His work is focused on addressing conservation challenges, including the loss of pollinators and other wildlife species, climate change, environmental pollutants, and restoring degraded upland and wetland landscapes. He has worked for environmental consulting firms, nonprofit organizations, and state government, and taught classes at the University of Minnesota over the last 25 years, with a focus on ecological design and restoration. He is also the author or co-author of several publications on rain gardens, stormwater management, and ecological restoration, including the recently released Grow Native ebook, Native Plants for Stormwater Management, Species Selection for the Lower Midwest, by Dan and Rusty Schmidt, which is available now for free download on our website under learn/manage-stormwater. Dan, thank you for joining us on our call to present on such a vital and interesting topic. I'll now turn things over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the introduction. I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions as we go along during the webinar. So today we'll be talking about resilient yards, keys for successful water management and pollinator conservation. We'll start off with talking about some of our challenges that we're facing. We have a lot of conservation challenges, so we'll start off with some of the more depressing parts of what we're facing. We'll talk about building resilient yards, some of the planning principles around these projects. Then talk about some specific project types that are really beneficial for addressing challenges. We'll look at helpful resources in addition, which include the recent book, and then management for long-term success. One of our challenges in our landscapes is the amount of impervious surfaces, and this includes rooftops, driveways, roadways. That can include compacted lawn areas as well. Sometimes a lot of water can run off of lawns, particularly in newer developments where soils may be compacted. And this can lead to the movement of sediments, nutrients, bacteria, salt, organic matter, heavy metals. Just a lot of material can be on the move after larger storm events. This material can move quickly into water bodies and then cause issues for algae blooms and just degrading the water quality for many different species. Our storm intensity has been increasing, and across the Midwest, we've been getting much larger storms, heavy downpours, and this really leads to increased impacts. It's moving pollutants, but it's also causing water fluctuations and other challenges within our water bodies. And our stormwater runoff is our #1 source of pollutants in lakes, rivers, and streams. In some cases, we talk about our driveways and streets being like shorelines because the water that is coming off of them is moving quickly into storm sewers and makes its way quickly into water bodies. So those pollutants can be on the move really fast, and cause problems in a short period of time. We also have large land areas that provide few ecological benefits. So we have really extensive lawns, excuse me, across the Midwest. So we're looking for ways to do more conversion of these lawn areas to convert them into no-mow type lawns, but particularly prairies and other types of habitats. It's around 9 billion gallons of water used every day on lawns across the United States, around 18 million gallons of gas used annually, and large amounts of fertilizer that are being applied onto these lawns. And there's multiple different challenges that wildlife species in particular are facing. Extreme precipitation is one of them related to climate change and increasing temperatures. Impervious areas, urban heat islands, which are related to those impervious areas, increases in invasive plants, habitat loss, pesticides and pollutants, water pollution, and high nutrients. So some of these can combine and cause increased stress for different wildlife. Worldwide, we've been having concerns about declines of insect populations. It's estimated that more than 40% of insect species are currently in decline. And many of our bird species eat insects. They really rely on insects for a major part of their life cycle. They're feeding insects to their young. So those declines in insects are impacting bird species as well. There's one study showing that bird species have declined so that there's around 3 billion less birds in North America since 1970. Ultimately, we're at a critical time for protecting biodiversity, and this is really leading to a lot of interest in this topic. Fortunately, we're finding that many residents and other people are really trying to find ways to help solve some of these challenges. And we stress that individual residents really can play an important role with managing water and rebuilding networks of important habitat. There's more research that's showing that even relatively small plantings and stormwater projects can have a big impact, particularly if there's a lot of them that are being built across neighborhoods and other areas. A lot of my work is in the upper Midwest, and one of the programs that I'm running right now is our Lawns to Legumes program. We've installed about 10,000 plantings through that program, and I've been fortunate to be able to work in other states, and there just seems to be a lot of momentum right now for these types of projects. And the Grow Native program does a lot of great work around habitat and promoting native plants. And so just another example of a group that's really working to build this movement to help improve our environmental conditions. A few of the key needs for pollinators include protection from pesticides. They need clean water sources, flower resources throughout the season. So they need spring, summer, and fall blooms. Also nesting sites and a network of habitat and protected refuge areas. And yards can be great places to incorporate habitat for pollinators in addition to managing water. With a resilient yard, there's a lot of different components that can be included within a relatively small area. Definitely native plants, which provide many benefits for wildlife, but also water quality. There's different types of stormwater projects that can be incorporated into landscapes, including rain gardens, swales, and buffers, which can capture and protect water. The deep roots of native plants are helping bring water into the ground. There's research showing that deep roots help pull water down. There's root channels that form as the roots extend further, and it just helps build healthy soil. We're also pulling carbon down into the ground, just a lot of benefits of those really deep roots. Trees and shrubs have many benefits. They can have stormwater benefits by intercepting water within landscapes. They capture carbon, provide shade, and reduce energy costs. And we also promote healthy soil practices. So decreasing compaction, wherever there's compaction, water isn't going to go into the ground well. And wherever we can add more organic content into the soil, we're able to capture more water. So in some cases, when we're doing planting projects, we're adding compost into the soil as a way to increase the sponge effect of that soil. It also helps promote the native plants as well. Next, we'll talk about some design concepts for habitat projects and stormwater planning. Google Earth is a good tool. It allows you to zoom in and measure polygons for an individual site. So that's a really good resource for doing some planning on a particular property. Site assessments can also be done on county GIS data layers and similar maps. So depending on where you're located, there may be different resources or information that you can use. You can even just use Google Maps to get a base map. It may not have as high a resolution as some of these other tools, but it could be a good starting point as well, just to have a base layer to start sketching on for your landscape. As we look at a landscape, there's different aspects of it that we look at. First, we're thinking about the function. Where are areas that you're using this landscape? Where are areas that maybe you're just mowing and there isn't much use of those areas? And those areas that you're only mowing, really not using, can be really good places for planting. So they could be good places for rain gardens. They could be good locations for native plantings. And really thinking about those use areas, and the native plants can be really effective at framing the areas that you're using. Existing trees and shrubs is another thing to look at and think about as far as placement of planting beds. Sometimes it's good to incorporate the trees and shrubs in your planting beds just to protect them a little bit more so you're not mowing around the bases of them. Also thinking about the drainage. So in this diagram, there's blue arrows showing the drainage that's going through this landscape. And it's helpful to think about where that water is moving, where the downspouts are, and how you can intercept that water as it's moving through a landscape. Then also think about sun and shade, which is really important for plant selection. Then as you're identifying these areas, you can start mapping them out a bit within the landscape, looking at where you could do planting beds or add to existing planting beds, and where you have lawn areas that you would want to maintain as lawn. And then also looking at where rain gardens could be located within the landscape. And that would really be based on where your downspouts are located and where you can intercept some of that water that's moving through the landscape. And we'll talk more about rain gardens. We usually recommend just sizing them to fit within the residential landscape. We size them bigger for commercial sites and other types of landscapes, but they just need to fit in and they need to be at a depth that's acceptable for residential landscapes. This is my house with our plantings that we have, and it's an example of using the plantings to frame the yard area that remains. So some areas we used, and so we're just framing around those yard areas. And it's just a good way to kind of think about building your plantings. And then you can see that we have some plantings around the trees and the shrubs in this landscape as well. Makes it a lot easier to mow, so you're not mowing around the trees and the shrubs. With site plans, there's quite a few different programs that are available now. If you do a web search on landscape planning tools, you'll find different software, different resources that are available. Some of them are more complex, like AutoCAD is used by a lot of design firms, but there's other ones that are really useful for residential projects, or they can be hand-drawn. They don't necessarily have to be done in a computer program. So just drawing plans by hand can be really effective, and just kind of mapping out where you want to put individual plants within your landscape. There's a number of reasons that we focus on native plants. One of the key ones is that our insect and wildlife species have adapted along with our native plants. So the native plants are going to provide the highest benefit for our wildlife species, and that would include everything from insects to birds to other types of wildlife. Having a diversity of native plants will benefit a wider range of insect species. We have over 500 species of native bees, and they all have unique needs. So we really need a diversity of native plants to really benefit the wide range of native bee species that we have across the Midwest. And many of those bees have been in significant decline. Some of the bumblebees have declined around 80% over 20 years. That's similar for the monarch butterfly. So we're really trying to find ways to support those species, and the native plants are really providing that support that they need. The deep roots, we talked about a little bit with the native plants. Some of the roots are going down as far as 15 feet, and those really do help pull water down into the ground. They're adding nutrients into the soil. And Kentucky bluegrass has roots that are about an inch. So there really isn't providing much ecological benefit within landscapes because of those really shallow roots compared to the deep roots that the diversity of native plants have. Next, we'll get into some project types for resiliency. We'll talk about 6 different types that can be beneficial within residential landscapes, but they can also be used in many other types of landscapes as well. Definitely commercial sites, more campus type landscapes, any of these types of projects can be incorporated into those areas as well. Rain gardens provide many environmental benefits. We mentioned that they should be sized to fit the yard or intended purpose. There's a lot of different places that they can be located within a landscape. Sometimes they're closer to the house where they're intercepting water that's coming from a downspout. They can be on a hillside, and there's a picture in the bottom center that's showing one that's bermed on a hillside. They can be up closer to a sidewalk to capture water. They're really versatile as far as where we place them. We typically don't place them in the lowest part of a landscape where it's already wet because we won't get much infiltration there. So it's actually more common that we're placing them up a little bit higher on hillsides or places where we can get more water infiltration. And this slide shows the Blue Thumb Guide to Rain Gardens. That was a book that I was involved in with a couple other authors, providing information about how to design and install rain gardens. And that book has been out for about 15 years now. So it's been out for quite a while, but still has very relevant information. A couple of key things with rain gardens. One is that they need a flat base. And the reason we design them with a flat base is so the water spreads out, that we don't get ponding in one location. That helps make sure that the water infiltrates evenly within the rain garden, but it also doesn't impact certain plants where the water may sit there longer. So there's a couple of reasons that having a flat base is important. There's inlets where the water is coming into a rain garden, also an outlet where if there's a really big rainfall, the water is going to move out. Sometimes that's a berm where it just overflows over that berm and then moves off. Depending on the soils, we may not do any soil amendment. If there's really heavy clay soils, then amending with some clay can be beneficial. If it's a really super sandy soil, then amending with compost might be helpful to just add some more organic content for the plants for growing. But many of the plants we use in these are adapted to kind of drier conditions overall. We use a lot of mesic prairie plants within rain gardens because they're adapted to either being in moist conditions or being able to dry out from time to time. So really the plants need to be adaptable to those conditions where they might get inundated for around a day, but then they drain out. A few standards for rain gardens, we try to keep them about 10 feet away from property lines, around 10 feet from building foundations, 10 or 50 feet from private wells and septic systems, and leach fields about 35 feet away. They will have water infiltrating down through them, and that's part of the reason we don't want them right next to a foundation, because there could be some water that is making its way towards the foundation and can create some sweating within those basement walls. So we try to keep them a little ways away. Sometimes it depends on the direction of the groundwater flow and just the slope of a site. They can be a little bit closer sometimes, but usually we're trying to keep them about 10 feet away. This slide has more pictures of rain gardens. Some of these are larger rain gardens along roads. When we're planting them along roadways, there's curb cuts that are being used to bring the water into the rain garden. And there's been some design changes with those practices as far as bringing water off of pavement, because the pavement can have more soil, just sediment that's accumulated, that'll be moving towards the rain garden, and it can start plugging up the base of it. So it's become more common to use catchment devices that will pre-treat as water is moving from a pavement into a rain garden. And these pre-treatment devices usually have a grate that can be pulled off, and then maintenance crews can scoop up soil that's accumulated in the pre-treatment area and remove that so that it doesn't go to the bottom of the rain garden where it'll impact the infiltration, but it can also impact the plants that are in the bottom of a rain garden. So there's a couple of reasons that those pre-treatment devices are really helpful. Next, we'll talk about swales, and swales can vary a lot within landscapes. It could be a roadside swale that is along more of like a county road, or it can be a swale within a residential or commercial site that's designed to move water. They can be really effective at moving water through a landscape, but allowing the water to infiltrate along the way and also vegetating them so they can have plant diversity within these swales. So they can be really versatile within landscapes. This is a park landscape where there's a swale running through this site. Sometimes we do put check dams within these swales just to back the water up, and in some ways creating little rain gardens along the way. So there's ways to slow the water up that's going through a swale as it's making its way down to a water body, but they're essentially a modification of a rain garden in some ways, because a lot of the plants that we use within these swales are pretty similar to what we would use in a rain garden. This is another site that has parking associated with it, and there's curb cuts that are going into the swale, and then the water is moving through the swale into larger collection areas. So it can be an effective way to incorporate native plants within a parking area. It just needs to be planned from the beginning to have these wider areas for collection, but it can be good places for trees to be planted to provide shade within these parking areas also. Next, we'll talk about filter strips, and filter strips are another method of protecting water bodies. Most often they're being planted along the edge of lakes, streams, and rivers to slow water down as it's moving through a landscape. That picture on the right is in a park, and there's impervious surfaces, sidewalk, and more compacted lawn areas that are further up. So the water that would be coming off those impervious surfaces is getting slowed down as it's moving through this landscape. All the stems that are there, the root systems, it's all working together to help slow that water and catch it and infiltrate it as it's making its way down towards the water body. And there's definitely a lot of different species that can be incorporated into these buffer plantings. There's music prairie species or dry prairie species that can do well. This planting has a combination of both, and it really depends on the soil texture as far as the types of plant species that we'd be selecting for an individual buffer. Next, we'll talk about native pocket plantings, which is a term that we use for smaller native gardens within residential landscapes. One thing we stress with these is that they can start off really small, and there's always opportunities to add to them over time. Research is showing that these small plantings can attract a lot of insects, particularly if they're planted with a lot of diversity of native forbs. These gardens that are well cared for end up producing a lot of pollen and nectar, and that's part of the reason that they're so beneficial for pollinators. We've had some drought years where these plantings are doing really well because people can mulch them, give them water from time to time. And we find that in some of our natural areas that pollinators are not doing well because of the plants are really suffering. So we think these types of plantings can be really important during times of drought. There's different ways that we establish these projects, and we'll talk more about that, using sod kickers to remove sod, sometimes suppressing the sod with cardboard. There's different methods that are being used for establishment of these smaller pollinator gardens. Usually they're including a combination of grasses, flowers, and shrubs. The grasses play an important role of supporting the flowers within these plantings. If you only plant flowers, sometimes the plants will start flopping over because they just don't have much support. So it's pretty common that we're using grasses or sedges along with these plantings. And sometimes we do a matrix planting of grasses and sedges just because they provide really good competition for any weed species that would want to come in to a planting. And then we plant the forbs in amongst those sedges and grasses. And that's a technique that's being used for rain gardens and swales and other types of plantings now as well, developing that grass and sedge matrix within the plantings. We do think about the layout of plants also. It's pretty common that we group plants together just for aesthetic reasons. It's nice to see larger masses of flowers. That can make it easier to do weeding as well. It's easier to identify where the native plants are versus where any weeds are located within a planting. And then planting shorter vegetation up towards the front of plantings, taller vegetation further back. Here's an example of a sod kicker, and sod kickers, it's just like it sounds. You're kicking it along, you're using your foot to kick along the metal bar that's up on top to remove sod from a landscape. It can be pretty efficient as long as you don't have a lot of roots or rocks within the soil. And I've had that experience trying to remove sod in those landscapes. And it can be pretty tricky using a sod kicker for removal, but works well for most lawns where it's just soil that's underneath that you're removing. There are mechanical sod cutters that can be rented from hardware stores, and those can remove sod very quickly. And sometimes the sod that's being removed can be rolled up and then given away to somebody else that is interested in receiving that sod. And then it's pretty common that we're using wood chips on these types of plantings, at least initially, for establishment to hold moisture in and suppress weeds. We really promote using local sources of wood chips and usually shredded hardwood chips because they stay in place really well. And they're really beneficial for rain gardens because they don't seem to float up and move like pine or other wood chips do. So those shredded hardwood chips are really good at staying in place. They kind of bind together because there's a lot of fibers in the wood chips. And as projects mature, sometimes we don't add as many wood chips. You might just add them around the edges. The hope is that plantings will get more dominated with the native vegetation, that we really don't need to add many wood chips into that area that the native plants are adding their organic material into the garden. Here's an example of using cardboard for suppressing lawn. And sometimes we'll plant directly through the cardboard and we'll mulch on top of the cardboard. Usually we'll wait a couple of months at least to let the grass underneath get suppressed by the cardboard. But you can plant directly through it. You just have to remove the sod that's underneath where you're going to be planting. So you can do it right away if you want to, but it's usually better to wait a while, let the grass get suppressed. And there's different types of materials that are being used now that are paper-based products that can be rolled out over planting areas that help suppress weeds. And I don't know how widely available those are across the whole Midwest, but we're finding that those are really useful for some areas just to have a little more weed suppression, have an organic material that we're putting down versus some other type of weed suppression. We'll get into helpful resources next. The native plants for stormwater management project just got completed. We were working on that project for a couple of years, and a good team working on this project. We think it'll be a really useful resource for stormwater management projects, but will be useful for pollinator plantings and other types of projects as well. There's discussions in the book about different stormwater practices like rain gardens, stormwater swales, tree trenches, a pretty long list of techniques that we use for managing water within landscapes. There's species lists for these individual practices. And then as you get further through the book, there's plant pages for individual species. And these plant pages provide a lot of information about the species. There's a real focus on the design considerations and the wildlife use of individual plants. And we also have charts in these plant pages that show the inundation tolerance of individual plant species. So it's showing how long the plant can be inundated before that plant would really start to decline and start to die. And we found these to be helpful for a lot of stormwater projects because it's helpful to think through what plants can survive the conditions that we're designing. If it's a stormwater pond where there's going to be inundation and a lot of water that's going to be holding for longer periods, the number of plant species that can handle those conditions are much more limited compared to a rain garden where we might be designing the rain garden to infiltrate within 24 hours. Then there's a lot more species that can be selected for those conditions. So the Laetris pycnostacia is a plant species that can't handle a lot of inundation. It does grow in meadow type communities, so it can handle some moisture, but doesn't like being inundated for long periods of time. And that's reflected in the chart that was developed for that species. And the book does include grasses, sedges, rushes, forbs, ferns, trees, and shrubs, a big variety of species that's included in the book. Some of these species, like palm sedge, is a good example where it can handle extended inundation periods. And that's reflected in the chart for that species, showing that it can handle long periods of inundation, but not necessarily really deep depths because it's not a tall plant. It can handle around 12 inches, but if it gets much higher than that, it can start overtopping the plant. And usually when plants get overtopped with water, they start to die. And that's part of the reason that this one has a limit as far as its height. Big blue stem is a mesic prairie plant. So it really can handle really long inundation periods, and that's reflected with this chart. There's different tree species that are included in the book. Swamp white oak is one that we've been using a lot across the Midwest. It's very climate adapted in many places. It can handle inundation while usually grows in floodplain type ecosystem, so it's adapted to those conditions where it may need to dry out at certain times, but may be inundated and really wet at times as well. So that's, uh, you know, part of how we understand these plants is just spending a lot of time in these natural areas, but also design landscapes to understand the tolerances of the plants. And we also had teams that were reviewing these charts to just assess them based on their knowledge and their background. The native plant database through Grow Native, another great resource for plant selection. You can put in site conditions into this resource and get plant species. So this is a great source of information for plant selection if you're not familiar with it. I think probably most of the audience is using this. I mentioned some of the programs that I'm working with, and that lawns and legumes program, we have a lot of resources that have been developed for that. So if you're further north, there's a lot of planting templates that have been developed through the lawns and legumes program. There's a planting for pollinators guide that goes along with the program. And this program has funding to help with installation of plantings, but we're finding that there's about as many people doing do-it-yourself projects just using the information and the guidance that's provided as the number of people that are requesting funding to do projects. So it's a real mix of do-it-yourself work and projects that are funded. We'll spend a little time talking about long-term management, just have a few slides on this. This is a really important topic because one of the main reasons that we see rain gardens and native plantings come out is because they get too weedy and difficult to manage over time. And that's where it's really important to just pay attention to what's happening with plantings, check on them periodically, and try to address any weed issues before they become a bigger problem. With our weather conditions, we've been having more drought, and that's been a real problem for projects and getting them established. We talk about plants usually needing about 1 inch of water per week. And that does vary depending on the soil type. If you have a clay soil, it might be a little bit less. If you have a sandy soil, it might be more. But it's kind of a standard as far as the amount of water that plants tend to need. And that includes both water from rainfall, but also water that is being applied through watering on a landscape. Pulling weeds, getting them when they're small, really important. It may be most important with woody plants, like woody invasive plants that are moving into plantings. We see that a lot with rain gardens, that they're good growing conditions for a lot of different species. And the woody plants, once they get started, their roots will just keep expanding. And if they just only get clipped off at the surface, they'll just keep getting a bigger root system. So it's beneficial to try to remove that whole plant early on before it gets too well established. Keeping plantings clear of debris, that can be a challenge with stormwater projects, that sometimes they can catch debris. That we see that with stormwater swales that are in low areas that they're catching debris. So having a maintenance planned in to go in and clean those out from time to time is really helpful. And then replacing mulch and plants as needed. Usually it's about once a year that we might come in and try to replace mulch within a planting. But if the plants are doing really well and they're dominating a site, we might just mulch around the edges. And that's pretty common of what I've done in landscapes, is just have the mulch along the edges to keep the lawn from encroaching on the native plantings and just create a bit more neatness along the front edge. With maintenance, it's good to be out there pretty frequently. It can be good exercise. So there's a number of reasons to go out and do maintenance in the garden, and just can be very relaxing to spend time in the garden. So going out there as often as you can to do maintenance is recommended, but at least 3 times a year. Sometimes we recommend around Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day as times to go out and do some maintenance. And that's true for commercial sites as well. You know, a lot of cases we're going out and maintaining them around 3 times a year. Sometimes more often we'll try to get out and do some monitoring of these sites just to check on how they're doing and make sure that they're in good shape. If it's a stormwater project, if there's a large rain event, sometimes we'll go out to check on the plantings just to make sure that the site is in good shape, that there's not a lot of erosion happening around the site. And so it'll depend somewhat on the weather conditions as well, but when we go out to check on sites. So main points, pulling weeds as you need to. Dividing plants and adding new plants. Many of our native plants can be divided, and we usually do that in earlier spring or in the fall. That can be good timing to separate plants when they won't get stressed by heat. And many plants just can be separated at the base. Like big blue stem, you might need a shovel or some other method to cut that mass up into multiple plants. Plants like wild geranium, you can dig up and usually just separate the roots with your hands. They come apart pretty easily, but it's a really good way to just get more plants into enlarged gardens within a landscape by separating them and expanding them. That's where with those native pocket plantings, they can be really small to start, but we really encourage people separating those plants and then expanding the size of those gardens. Inspect for erosion and trouble spots. In the spring, we recommend cutting back plants after average temperatures are around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, around Mother's Day typically, but leaving some hollow and pithy stems for pollinators to nest in. So not cutting everything all the way down, because many of our native pollinators nest in stems. Some of them, like bumblebees, are nesting in the ground, and they benefit from some bare ground areas within landscapes. But many of the smaller bee species are nesting within stems, and that's where it's beneficial to have some stems that are remaining within landscapes. So I covered a lot of topics there, and a lot of different types of practices. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about any of the information that we were discussing.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. And yeah, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section. You can keep adding questions there, but we have a good little backlog, so I'm just gonna start if you're ready. We had one question of rain garden success in a really highly shaded area, so just kind of a really moist situation. Can you speak to successful gardens that you've seen that have had a lot of shade?
Yeah, those can be good areas for rain gardens. The plant selection does change a lot as far as what we're looking at that can survive in those conditions. And there's different ferns that can do well in those moist areas, like cinnamon fern or interrupted fern. Those are species that can handle the moist conditions and the shade. Different sedges can do well there as well. The palm sedge that I mentioned earlier can survive, but also some flowering plants like wild geranium and columbine are well suited to those shady gardens also. So there's quite a few options of species that can survive there. It just, you would want to think about how long the water is standing in those areas, because some of the plants like the wild columbine won't like being in inundation for too long. So they're probably better suited to the edges of those gardens versus being in the base. But some of the taller ferns and the sedges can do well in the base of a shady rain garden and really thrive in those conditions. They'll have moisture, they'll have the shade they need, so that can be a good location for them.
Great, thank you. And whenever you're establishing these rain gardens, are you doing actual sort of like excavation to make a flat bottom? And can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's similar how we start with other types of plantings. We remove the sod, and then we are digging these down a ways. And for most residential rain gardens, we're going down about 6 inches to 9 inches typically. We can go down deeper, but for residential sites, sometimes it just seems like too much of a depression there if you go down around a foot. But for larger commercial sites, it is fine to go down about a foot or deeper. So we are digging these out. Sometimes, putting string around the edges just to define the edges of the rain garden that we're creating, and then using a long level usually to look at how flat we are in the base. There's laser levels, there's string levels, there's just regular construction levels. There's different ways that you can figure out whether your base is flat. For a residential rain garden, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we do try to get the base flat just to spread that water out. And really the size of the rain garden can vary depending on where you're putting it. And in some cases, we just try to have multiple smaller depressions through a landscape, and one of them might flow into another one. So don't feel like you really need to create a big rain garden that's going to collect all your water coming off your property. You might have a couple or 2 or 3 smaller ones that are collecting water coming off of different areas in your landscape.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful and good to hear that, yeah, you don't have to do one big planting. Maybe it's more achievable to do a couple of small ones. So thank you so much. We had a question with fall or, an overwintering rain garden. Is it okay, or can you put fall leaves in these gardens, or would that impact the planting?
Yeah, usually it's fine, and that's true with most native plantings. In our own landscape, we use the leaves to mulch the plantings in the fall, and we don't chop them up. There's a lot of larvae that can be associated with leaves and cocoons and things, so we discourage chopping it up really fine because those can be destroyed. So we're just trying to move the leaves into the landscape. You're not going to want them super thick, but in a lot of cases, having around 3-4 inches of leaves that are just moved into those landscape areas are okay. That they're going to provide mulch, are going to provide warmth for the plants over winter. They can break down pretty fast within landscapes. Leaves from like maples and basswood will decompose faster than oak leaves will. So you may not want as thick of a layer of oak leaves over a landscape as some other leaves that can break down faster. But we see a lot of benefits of using leaves within different types of plantings, including rain gardens. You can always remove some in the spring if they just seem like they're too thick within a garden. Sometimes we know it if you raked your lawn and you just have so many leaves that it's just too much for your plantings, your lawn may be too big. So maybe it's a good idea to shrink down the lawn so that you don't end up with so many leaves that are coming off of your lawn areas that you're just trying to provide more habitat. But one other note with that is that plantings underneath trees play a really important role, and we didn't get into that, but there's a concept called soft landings where there's many insect species that essentially live in trees, and then they drop larvae. Like walking sticks is a good example as an insect, where they'll drop their larvae down to the ground. They mature or they'll drop their eggs, the larvae mature, they'll go back up the tree. So there's this whole ecosystem that forms between trees and the plants that are underneath trees. So we really promote having plants underneath trees, and we've been trying to promote that more on campus type landscapes because there's so many campus landscapes that just have trees out in the middle of lawn areas. And it's really beneficial if we can get more native plantings around those trees.
Great, thank you. Do you have any thoughts on using chopped leaves as mulch? Is that a good practice?
Yeah, I think the leaves, they work in a similar way to the wood chips that we're using. And that's part of the reason that I like using them in the fall for plantings. We don't need to be adding more wood chips into landscapes. So it's less resources because it's a local resource that's there within the garden. And, you know, same with chopped leaves, that you wouldn't want to add too many into a landscape. You might start suppressing some of the native plants that are there. Like some of our sedges, like woodland sedge, which we have in our book, stays really low to the ground. So if you covered that up too thick, it's probably not gonna do well surviving through the winter because it does stay green through the winter and needs to respirate. So that's where you might want to kind of pull it around some really low growing plants. And if you have spring ephemerals that are coming up in the spring in certain areas, you wouldn't want a really thick layer on those either because they do need to make their way up in the spring. And some of those aren't really big aggressive plants, so they have a hard time coming up through too much leaf litter. So that's where, you know, with heavier chopped leaves, I wouldn't want too thick of a layer, maybe just a couple of inches of chopped leaves that would be put over those types of areas.
Definitely, thank you. And also considering the chopping may be killing all the, or a lot of maybe the moth larvae and things that are in. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
all within reason, definitely.
Mhm.
We have one question about the resiliency of these plantings to deer traffic. Can you speak to deer grazing in your experience?
Yeah, it's a common problem across the Midwest and rabbits as well. So it's something that we think about quite a bit within these areas. There are some plants that aren't favored quite as much by deer and rabbits. Plants in the mint family don't seem to be eaten as much. Anything that has a really fuzzy stem seems to do better, like boneset or hoary vervain. Plants like that don't get grazed as much because deer don't seem to like that texture of those stems. Plants like wild onion, anything in the garlic, or onion family, don't tend to get grazed much either. So there are certain plants that can be selected. Any woody plants that are more thorny, they're not going to like. It's even a consideration with buck rubbing on trees. We're finding that if we leave a lot of the lower branches, that the trees are safer than if we've been pruning up the lower stem of small trees, because the bucks don't like to get in there where there's a lot of pokey branches and try to rub their antlers. So we're learning more as we go with doing this work about how to manage around deer and rabbits. I've known people that have put a lot of sticks in their native gardens so that as deer try to get down to eat, that they get poked by the sticks. And so there's different ways of just trying to manage to deter deer. Fencing obviously can do it as well, but that's more intensive as an approach. And just trees and shrubs, sometimes those are better in certain landscapes, but deer will eat trees and shrubs as well. So it will depend on the tree species as far as what they prefer and what they eat. So I don't know if we have any magic solutions. There are sprays that are being used as well, and those can work pretty well, but you need to reapply those. So that can take some work to just keep that up over the course of a growing season.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple questions about salt runoff. So you can speak to it however you like, but what are the effects? Is there anything that a homeowner can do if they see effects that they think might be coming from the salt. Just wondering about salt runoff.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion about salt, just trying to decrease the amount of salt that's being used within landscapes. If there's snowfall, just trying to remove it as quickly as possible so it doesn't turn to ice. Using sand when you can, using any other alternatives that are available for salt. We're finding where there's heavy salt use across the Midwest that the saline content of the soils and even groundwater is being affected. So we're just trying to really decrease the amount of salt use. Certain plants can handle salt. Usually it's our invasive plants that can do the best in those types of conditions. And there are native plants that can do pretty well with salt. We find that dry prairie species may be the most tolerant of salt because they're used to growing in drier conditions where there may be a bit more salt buildup in the soil. And that's why they seem to be more tolerant. And so that, that would be things like prairie dropseed, cytosgrama, little bluestem. Those types of grasses can do pretty well where there is some salt within soils or salt that's moving off of impervious surfaces. Within a rain garden, sedges might be the most tolerant in the base of a rain garden if there's a lot of salt coming in from impervious areas. Sometimes we do mainly use grasses and sedges in the base of rain gardens where there is quite a bit of water moving off of impervious surfaces because there may be some contaminants moving in there as well. And we don't necessarily want the contaminants to move up into the pollen and nectar of flowers. So if there are areas where we think there may be more contaminants moving off of impervious areas, we'll put the flowers up on the upper edges and focus more on the grasses and sedges in the base. But that would be true with areas where there's more salt moving through a landscape as well. Those grasses and sedges are probably going to be more tolerant to that.
Great, thank you so much. We had one question that was speaking to the difference between a rain garden and a detention basin. So, and you mentioned that it's not like all the plants in a rain garden like moisture. So can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, the rain gardens, we usually design those so that the water will infiltrate within 24 hours. And that's partly to deter mosquitoes from breeding within rain gardens. We don't want them holding water for long periods, but we also want to be able to promote plant diversity within them. And if we have the water sustaining in them too long, then there's a lower number of plants that can really survive within those rain gardens. There's different types of larger basins. There's detention basins and retention basins. Retention basins retain water in them quite often all the time. They have some water in them. And it's most common that we're planting on the edges around that water with native plants, plants that can survive moisture on the edges, but they usually go up and slope pretty fast. So we're usually planting drier prairie plants on the upper slopes of those rain gardens. So many of the rain garden seed mixes that we work on are more dominated with prairie plants because most of what we're planting are the prairies that are around the edges of those retention areas. Ponds, there's dry ponds, so ponds that dry out, they're designed to dry out. And those have more options for planting. Sometimes they'll have a lot of water coming in and they'll get inundated for a while, but then they dry out and they dry down. So it's similar to a rain garden in some ways. It's just usually a bigger basin and more water that's moving into that basin at one time. So there's less species that can survive in those dry ponds and what can survive in a rain garden. And there are different grasses, like switchgrass tends to do pretty well in those because switchgrass in a lot of cases grows along rivers where it can be dry or sometimes get inundated. trees like swamp white oak can work well in those areas because they can handle that change in hydrology. The palm sedge can do pretty well because it's used to growing in floodplains. So anything that's used to growing in like a floodplain habitat can survive pretty well in those retention ponds where there's these drastic changes from inundation to drying down.
Great, thank you. And that's where this guide, or one of the many ways that it's very useful, is those descriptions of how many days a species can tolerate being inundated. So we put that in the chat and we'll send it out and repeat it often because it's really great for that. And while you mentioned swamp white oak being, it works for a couple of different reasons for you. Do you have suggestions for other shrubs or trees to use in a swale to kind of anchor the planting? Do you have any other favorites like that?
Yeah, different dogwoods can be pretty effective in those types of plantings. Like silky dogwood is a pretty versatile dogwood species that can handle a fair amount of moisture and can actually handle some prolonged inundation. So that can be a good option. Buttonbush, is one of my favorites for a lot of different types of landscapes. I've seen it growing really well in upland gardens, and I've seen it growing in standing water. So it's another species that is just super versatile that can handle a wide range of conditions. Indigo bush, Amorpha fruticosa is another one that's growing usually along larger rivers, and it's just really tough. It can handle being dry at times or being inundated at other times. So those are, a few other ones that seem to be able to handle those conditions pretty well.
Great, thank you. We have someone who's describing a park in their city with a sewer line running through it, and they're observing the soil on top washing away. You mentioned, we have to be careful about where we're putting our plantings in regards to structures, but are there plants that you would suggest to sort of quickly keep the soil in place?
Yeah, so that would really depend on the situation or the soil type, the amount of hydrology, the amount of water that might be flowing through in a certain area. Sometimes we use cover crops for those types of areas as like a first line of defense. So we might be using oats just to stabilize that area. And it's become more common that we actually do use a species like oats or winter wheat or rye to stabilize an area, and it helps rebuild some of the soil structure and the microbes in the soil, and then we'll plant into that. So it's become actually more common for prairie plantings to do that, particularly sites where there might be agricultural chemicals in the soil or other contaminants that we want to break down before we introduce the native plants into a site. So some covers might be an option there just to get it stabilized and to kind of rebuild some of the structure there. But then using native plants that can establish pretty quickly probably would be beneficial in that site. So things like Canada wild rye might be a good option. If it's pretty dry, prairie or Cytosgrama does well in a lot of really bad soils. So that is a pretty fast establishing native plant that could be beneficial in that area. But then probably a lot of different prairie plants. If it is full sun, I think introducing some type of prairie mix there would be beneficial to build more soil structure, and those deep roots that I was talking about earlier are really effective at holding slopes and preventing erosion. It's another important benefit of the deeper roots is they just create a network of kind of like a net underneath the ground to hold the soils in place.
Great, thank you. And you just addressed this in the end of your answer of how important these plantings and the roots are for maintaining slopes, but can you speak to establishing plantings on slopes? How to go about that?
Yeah, slopes are definitely more challenging to get native plants established. And sometimes we establish them with seed, other times with containerized plants. When we're seeding onto a slope, it's important to make sure any weeds are controlled first. And that's just true with any native planting that we're doing. We want to make sure that we have good control of the weeds before we introduce the native plants. Otherwise, we're going to have long-term maintenance problems on that site. So that would be the first step with the control. And if we're seeding onto a slope, it's more common that we'll use a native seed drill to drill seed in, because we don't want the seed to move if there's a heavy rainfall. So it's less common that we would hand broadcast on a steeper slope. It's more common that we would drill seed into a slope to get that seed into the ground a ways, at least the grasses into the ground, so that they're going to hold better. And then if there's a risk that there's going to be more erosion, more soil movement, we'd be using some type of fabric to put over the top. But the type of erosion fabric we use can be important. We try to make sure that the erosion fabric has some gaps in it, at least like a ½ inch, so that the native plants can get up through. It's usually not that much problem for the grasses because they're monocots, they just send up one leaf, but the forbs send up 2 leaves and they'll get caught up in fabric. So we're trying to make sure that there's a way for them to get up. And then we're also really encouraging not using plastics, because a lot of erosion fabrics have historically had plastic in them. So we're trying to really discourage that, to not add more plastic into the landscape. If you're doing containerized plants on a slope, that can be tricky because those slopes dry out really fast. And for a plant that was grown in a nursery and watered every day, that's moved on to a slope, it just doesn't have a very good chance of survival. And so usually what I'll do in those situations is like create a bit of a terrace for that individual plant. So a terrace and a little bit of a berm around it, so that it's has its own little catchment, like a little mini rain garden there to catch water when it does rain, or if you're watering that slope. And that can work for trees and shrubs as well as smaller herbaceous plants. For a tree and shrub, you just need to create a bigger terrace and a bigger berm to capture water. But it can be really important, because that's the biggest reason that those plantings fail on slopes is a lack of water. And it's just really hard to be out there often enough watering on a slope. And that's where it's maybe not real common that we're using containerized plants on slopes, because we just find a high failure rate of those plantings unless they're well cared for.
Great, thank you. Can you speak to, you mentioned, yeah, maybe seeds are more successful on a slope planting. Can you speak to any specific species that are easy to establish from seed, maybe that you would recommend? Of course, it depends on all the conditions, but.
Yeah, any of the cool season grasses tend to establish fast. And so species in the rye family, like Canada wild rye, Virginia wild rye, are species that we commonly use. Annual ryegrass comes in fast. I think that's pretty well distributed around the Midwest. Black-eyed Susan as a forb comes in really fast and establishes well within plantings. Hoary vervain we see come in on slope type areas and establish quickly as well. I need a species list in front of me. Columbine, like in a shaded area, does well to come in fast. It seems like it can handle slopes. It can handle like rocky areas pretty well also. So yeah, plants that we consider early successional are ones that are going to kind of grow the fastest, stabilize, and then hopefully later successional plants like coneflower, milkweeds, things like that are going to come in and start dominating a site, partly because a lot of those wild rye's and shorter lived grasses they fade out within about 3 years. So when we're using those on a buffer, like a filter strip, we know they're going to fade out, and we need the other plants in a seed mix to make sure they're going to be there to replace the ones that are disappearing over a few years.
Great, thank you so much. And again, this wonderful guide that you helped prepare, and there's many guides for this that will circulate, but it's also great to just hear from your direct experience. So thank you so much. We had one question about in pulling weeds to maintain the garden, is there any reason to not pull weeds in the winter if you see something green there in the winter time?
I think it's fine to pull weeds in the winter. Maybe the only thing we get concerned about with any weed pulling is just soil disturbance, that you're creating conditions for more weeds to come in. So I think regardless of when you would pull a weed from a garden, you might want to get some type of organic content on top of that area. And I do that sometimes in wooded areas, like if we're pulling buckthorn or some woody invasive plant, there's quite often a lot of disturbance that happens there. And sometimes those are places where garlic mustard or some other invasive is going to move in. So after we pull out a plant and disturb a bigger area of soil, you might just go collect a lot of thatch from grasses or something and put it down there to create some suppression, so that that location where you expose the soil isn't just going to become the next weed patch within the garden. Could be done with wood chips or leaves as well, just trying to suppress those plants. And actually, I've been experimenting a lot more with just using plant material to suppress invasive plants. I don't like using herbicide, so like cutting buckthorn low to the ground and then just getting a lot of thatch material and creating a mound around it sometimes is enough to suppress it. And we've used coffee cans and things, and that works well. And there's buckthorn baggies and other things for doing that for invasive woody plants. But I'm finding it works pretty well just to use organic material to put over stumps, but that could be true with any weed that you have in your garden. Sometimes for larger gardens, I just walk around with like a machete type knife, just clipping off the weeds, particularly annual and biennial weeds. I don't pull them up because I know they're not going to really be a long-term issue within those plantings. I'm just trying to prevent them from producing more seed. So just going around, it could be just a lopper or something, and just clipping them off, but ideally before they produce seed. And it doesn't take a lot of time. You're spotting those weeds. So you don't necessarily have to pull out every weed that's in a garden. Sometimes you can just clip them off. It's more of an issue with perennial and invasive plants that just clipping those off usually isn't going to work. They're just going to come right back. So finding another way to suppress those is going to be needed, or pull them out.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to hit you with about 3 more questions. So
Okay.
we really appreciate you and your time. So thank you so much. One question do you know of any plants that deter mosquitoes?
That's a good question. There are some, but I don't know if there's any native plants that I know of that deter mosquitoes. Maybe wild onion might be one that would deter mosquitoes. I was reading about this recently, but I can't remember the details of what species were being used. I think it was more non-native cultivated species that deter mosquitoes, like tansy and species like that pretty much deter all insects. So yeah, I'd have to research that one a little bit more.
Great, thank you. There was one, so in an earlier slide, you used the phrase equitable engagement. Can you speak to that phrase or clarify it for anyone that doesn't understand that?
Yeah, that's something we're thinking about with our conservation programs. I run several conservation programs, and we're just trying to make sure that there's equal opportunities to be successful with our programs, no matter of income levels or where people live or communities. And so that's something that with that lawns to legumes program in particular, we've really been focused on. We have ranking, it's making sure that there's distribution across the state and in environmental justice areas of the state. So it's something we're thinking more about with these conservation programs. In a lot of cases, historically with conservation, there's needed to be quite a bit of match that's provided for grants or programs to participate. So we're thinking about that related to programs as well, trying to find ways to make sure that people can participate, they can be successful with these programs. And in some cases, it means having different technical resources that we're developing or resources in different languages as well. So it's you know, something we're trying to figure out how to be more successful with. And that lawns and legumes program has been a good test for us as we've been working with lots of residents around the state. We've had around 40,000 applications for that program. So there's really been high interest for that program for doing these types of plantings. So I was talking about that movement earlier, and we see it happening because people are really engaged. They want to be part of a solution for climate change and for biodiversity loss. So that's been really encouraging just to see that interest. And the interest comes from across the whole population. So we really want to be able to include everybody in the work.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll have this be our last question. It's building on what you were just speaking on the programs in order to help people begin these plantings, but someone put in a question of, it seems to me like this is very expensive. Is this true? Or maybe, and can you speak to the programs that people could be involved in, which you have, like lawns to legumes, but how do we address the sort of expense or perceived expense of these sorts of projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been talking to groups all across the country related to these programs and trying to get different efforts started up in different parts of the country. I think what we found with some of our programs is that having funding really helps build momentum. So there's a definite advantage of having a funding source because we're providing $400 grants to residents to do projects, and that is building a lot of excitement around that work. But I think, a lot of this work with native plants can be done without a lot of expense. And I've experimented a lot over the years on different landscapes. When I was coming out of school and starting, I didn't have money to spend on native plants. So I was out collecting my own seed, growing plants. My wife and I did start a native plant nursery just because we were very interested in, native plants and trying to propagate them. But I think what I learned over time is that there's a lot of ways to grow plants that doesn't take a lot of cost. A lot of people are using a milk jug method to establish native plants on their own. There's a lot of information on the web about that method. I talked a bit about separating plants, and I found that to be really useful, and I still do that where I'm living now. I separate plants every spring and fall, and it's both herbaceous plants and woody plants. There's a lot of woody plants that can be separated as well, like black chokeberry might be a good example that's in our book. You can dig up the root mass and separate out that plant and get more plants essentially. So I'm a big proponent of that because I don't think this work needs to be expensive. And we also see a lot of communities coming together around this work. We have communities that are growing plants together. It's kind of a social activity to get together and plant seed and do gardening together. Sometimes they're sharing plants between residents, and that can be really beneficial. We've run into problems with that with jumping worms because we don't want to be spreading jumping worms around. So whenever plants are being moved from one property to another, we recommend that they really get washed thoroughly, the root systems, to make sure there's no jumping worm larvae there. But those are all ways that people can participate in growing native plants and propagation, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money.
Great, exactly. And someone just mentioned wild ones in the chat, your local master gardener program, master naturalist programs, grow native, your local Facebook pages. Yeah, it's exactly what you said of communities are really sort of coming together around this and can support each other. But thank you, Dan. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much. There's already a ton of great feedback. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. It was enjoyed doing the webinar.
Absolutely. And we'll pass it back to Amanda, who's going to tell us about some future events.
All right. Many thanks to Dan and Lily for guiding us through the live questions. And thanks to all of you tuning in who contributed to our conversation. Access to this recording and other related information will be sent to all who registered in a follow-up email tomorrow afternoon. So keep your eyes out for that. Before we conclude today's webinar, I have a couple of announcements for upcoming events that you won't want to miss. Register now and join us Wednesday, February 26th at 4 p.m. for our MPF webinar, Horizon 2, 1 part wildlife, 1 part ecosystem services, and 1 part renewable energy. That's with Steve Mallory and Ben Kruger. Then plan on joining us for webinars in March on grassland grouse, beauty, biology, and conservation, and native cool season grasses and sedges for landscaping, forage, and wildlife benefits. Both of those will be on our events pages for registration very soon. Next, mark your calendars for Missouri Prairie Foundation Spring Plant Sales happening in cities across Missouri, March through May. More information on each sale, including participating vendors and pre-order details, can be found across all of our channels and in the follow-up email that will be reaching your inbox tomorrow. Registration for all of the aforementioned events and much more can be found at our website under the Events tab. Also, one final reminder to make sure that you sign our form to get your resource guide hot off the presses delivered to your address. Make sure to register for that by Friday of this week using our link to our website for resource guides. We'll also be including that link in our follow-up email. Thank you so much for joining, and everybody have a great night.